Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. On today's show, the Mets are going to the NLCS. We break down the Mets taking care of the Phillies and moving on. So remember to subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcast. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today and subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your pods. If you'd like to drop us a review, drop us a mailbag question with that review. Watch us on YouTube and ask mailbag questions in the comments under the show there as well. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always, but for the first time in Mets Pod history, as a co-host that is covering the Mets going on to the NLCS, Joe DeMeo. Joe, what a wild ride it's been, and we are so happy it continues. I'm not going to say a little longer because it feels like a lot of longer right now.
This team, man, I mean, just it's so crazy. The preseason expectations being essentially non-existent. Everyone always says it. We said it on the last show we did, right? Like, everyone's always just like, no one gave us a shot. But genuinely, no one gave this Mets team a shot. 0-5. Gary Cohen on the broadcast just saying,
rock bottom.
Well, this is rock bottom. And here we are, months later. The New York Mets made the National League Championship Series, and it's crazy to think. I feel like we've been doing a podcast together, whether it was with SNY or before we joined SNY. I feel like we've been podcasting forever. The reality is that it hasn't been that long, and but just being able to celebrate the fact that the Mets are making this accomplishment, and just insane to just say out loud, in the next day or two, there's going to be 4 teams left in baseball, and the New York Mets are one of them. Crazy.
That's the most jarring part of it all. And I think the other jarring part is that every time on the broadcast they mention it's been 9 years. I don't know why the 2015 run felt not that far away. And when you hear almost this decade...
It's called getting older, Connor.
Older, faster. Yeah. And you look back at how different that team was. And then you remember Brandon Nimmo, it feels like he's been here forever. His debut was in 2016 when they lost the play-in game. So we have so much to get through today. It's funny. This is like round 2 of our emotions because we've been recording these in the middle of the night. So you could tell we've been through all the way the upper of the celebration and rode that wave out. And now the relaxation of like, okay, let's look at everything that happened right now. We're scaling back. We're stepping back. We're catching our breath. We're regaining our voice, our emotions. I mean, Joe, let's just go through what we just watched, right? Because at the end of the day, the Mets upset the Brewers, and then they upset the Philadelphia Phillies. The Mets are not supposed to be here. They keep finding a way. They keep coming up in the biggest moments. Hint, hint, Francisco Lindor, Pete Alonso coming up in the biggest moments. The guys that are supposed to be stars are playing like stars. But I think we scale it all the way back when you look at just how much of a team effort this has truly been. The fact that you have someone like David Peterson getting key outs across games, not at the start of games. You had even the return of Kodai Senga for 2 innings. We're going to get into Quintana a lot because Quintana has started the 2 biggest games of the season and truly kept the Mets in it in a way that I don't even know if the Mets expected that from him. And when you look at a young Mark Vientos, who's 9 for 16 in the playoffs right now, a guy that was a total afterthought out of spring training, a complete afterthought. He's now one of the most important pieces for the entire franchise that seems totally unmoved by the moment. He's not phased at all. He gets up there like it's a game in May and swings the bat and hits the ball 100 miles an hour and makes things happen. There's so much to unpack here, Joe. But I think the big picture for me, looking at how they got here and how they did this, and the Phillies are absolutely shell-shocked right now. When Lindor hit the grand slam, the faces we saw were like their souls were ripped out. Their souls were just completely ripped out, and they had really no answer for what they had just witnessed because the Citi Field environment had swallowed them whole. All of the Mets fans screaming for this moment, dying for this moment. It all bubbled up into one beautiful series win. But at the end of the day, this is a team that came together and everybody did their part. It's not a team that's led by one player or one ace, or look at the Phillies. We need to get back to Philly, and we have Zach Wheeler on the mound. The Mets every single night felt like they're going to win because they're confident in who's throwing, and they're confident that their lineup's going to come through yet again. And consistently, everyone answered the bell.
And just to shout out the Citi Field crowd, I was there at Game 3, and I went to all the series in 2015, and Shea way back when, 2006.
Oh, yeah.
I was at the
shake.
Yeah, Shea literally shook, so it's not.
Yeah, it would.
It's a little bit different. I was there for the LaDuca tagging 2 guys out at the plate game, but the crowd in Game 3 and what I heard on TV tonight for Game 4, way different than 2015. I haven't been at Citi Field for an environment like I was for Game 3. It was sold out, of course. Every seat is filled, and they sold a bunch of standing room. I walked around that place. There were people mobbed behind every single section on the field level. There wasn't a spot not taken by a human body. So just huge shout out to the Mets fans, and that's what this is. That's what New York is. That's what Citi Field can be. If the Mets are able to be this consistent contender that they intend to be, this is the environment that they can sustain. But to talk about the team, it feels like, of course, the big moments, Francisco Lindor, and we'll get into everything with that tonight. Pete Alonso, the guys that you expect to do it are doing it, and that's huge. And it is every day somebody does a little something. Vientos has been so consistent. Every starting pitcher has given them a good outing. I mean, in the playoffs, none of the starters have gotten rocked out of the game early. That hasn't happened. The bullpen's been, on and off shaky, and certainly, I'll say it, tonight's game was pretty maddening that the offense struggled to put these runners in scoring position in. They could have taken over this game early, but sometimes when you're facing good competition, that's gonna happen. Ranger Suarez, they just couldn't read his curveball out of his hand. He couldn't throw it for a strike, but they couldn't read it, and they were just chasing it essentially every single time. But it's so fun to watch this team, whether it's Jesse Winker, whether it's Tyrone Taylor. It feels like every day someone's doing something. Taylor with the throw, obviously in Game 3, but feels like every day someone is contributing, and this truly is a team effort. And to your point, Connor, not a team that's like, we really got to get to this pitcher for us to have a chance, or man, these 2 hitters, if they don't hit, we're in trouble. The Mets are a well-constructed team that plays together like a contending, potentially World Series appearing team does.
That's exactly right. They even say phrases like pass the baton, and no one's trying to be a hero all the time. And it did feel like in this game, Joe, to your point about Rangers curveball, there were a couple of times where guys did want to be the hero because it's a game clinching scenario, and they kept getting runners on, and somebody wanted to hit one 700 feet, and you're just sitting there. And despite that, we've been through this thousands of times this year, it feels like you're going, man, maybe they just missed their opportunity. Maybe they just missed it. And then sure enough, they get the bases loaded, and it felt like they missed their opportunity again after Alvarez went down. But you hear My Girl start to play in the ballpark. You hear everybody start to sing, and you see the best player in the National League take his warm-up cut and look at the pitcher, and you just know everything's going to be fine. It's one of the most bizarre feelings I've ever had as a baseball fan, because every single time Francisco Lindor comes through, it's just a matter of what degree. Is he going to get a walk to get things going? Is he going to get a single to keep the line moving? Is he going to rip a double down the line? Or is he going to hit the ball a mile? And tonight, we had one of the greatest moments, I think, in Mets playoff history, where Francisco Lindor gets up and hits an absolute moonshot to center field and puts his head down and trots around the bases. The ballpark is jumping and screaming. And Lindor, because he knows the game's not over in that moment. Everybody is all in this, why isn't he excited? Why isn't there emotion? Lindor says it after the game. Just listen to him. He says, I know we still have to go win a baseball game. It's not over. It's one of the most amazing things I've ever seen, because I don't know how anybody can keep, on the flip side, look at how Jesse Winker and Pete Alonso celebrate during big home runs, which to each their own. Celebrate however you want. That's your moment. But Lindor, this version of Lindor, and I went back and watched the grand slam he hit for Cleveland in the playoffs against the Yankees many years ago, a younger Francisco Lindor. And he did a little bit of the flex raise, and he was smiling. This version of Francisco Lindor is so locked in and so much tunnel vision that I don't think we'll see him fully just breathe out until they win a World Series. And you have to respect that for, a competitive professional athlete. It's just a different level. This is what the Mets have needed, right? The Mets have been a team that since 2019, they've had some young talent. They have good players, but it felt like they needed an edge to them. And this year, Winker's the villain. Lindor is the best player on the team and will not stop until they win a World Series. And the pitching staff has come together as one unit, not one guy pitching, but when that guy comes off the mound, they all hug and jump in the dugout. And that's the difference of this team right now. That is how they are advancing to the NLCS.
Francisco Lindor has just matured into that true leader that, he is not that young kid from Cleveland.
No.
And, the same reaction that he had in Atlanta. This guy hit 2 of the biggest home runs in this franchise's history in the last 2 weeks. And he treats it like any other thing. And, as you mentioned, after a game, he also threw in there, he goes, yeah, I was celebrating on the inside, but I want to win it all. And that is what Lindor said back when the Mets traded for him and signed him, and he had all these press conferences. He was here to win. That is what he wanted to do. And like you said, he is laser focused, and to have that at bat against Carlos Estevez, fantastic reliever that the Phillies traded some real meaningful prospects to get at the deadline, pumping 100 miles an hour. And on the second pitch, Lindor looked like he had one of those swings you were just talking about, Connor, that he was trying to hit the ball 579 feet. Like he swung out of his shoes and swung through it. Took a timeout, stepped back in, and just easy swing. 99.4 was the velocity of the fastball. Estevez missed down the middle, and Lindor made him pay. And that is what great players do. Great players step up in the biggest moments. And Lindor was, he obviously had a great run in Cleveland. But when you watch him with this team, Francisco Lindor is a player that was meant to be in New York City. And we always talk about how players will adjust and how will they handle New York and the bright lights. Lindor wants it. And that crowd was crazy. MLB tweeted like the ballpark cam where it's not the TV feed, but
the Nat sound.
Yeah, just the Nat sound in the stadium. Place came completely unglued, not to any surprise, but just a huge moment for literally the face of this franchise for now and for years and years going forward.
It's an amazing feeling as a fan, just knowing that this is the nucleus of the team, right? And one more moment that I want to appreciate before we, we'll do 2 superlatives here, but seeing Brandon Nimmo in tears after they won, when you realize, we talked about this at the time with Wilmer Flores. I think a lot of people overlook when someone is drafted or signed to the Mets as a teenager, and it's their entire, you go through so much change from when you're a teenager to when you enter your early 30s, because that is literally like your entire, maturation and adulthood. Brandon Nimmo was drafted as a high schooler out of Wyoming to New York City, and a place where they didn't even have fully organized baseball for him necessarily growing up.
They played Legion ball. He didn't have like true high school
Exactly.
baseball. He played Legion ball. Yeah.
Exactly. And he had a longer road that you could speak more to, Joe, as a prospect. It's not like he came up as a 21-year-old and lit the world on fire. And he turns into a very successful major leaguer, one of the biggest class acts in all of baseball. Signs a long-term contract to stay here that felt like a kind of final hour signing. There was definitely a chance he was leaving. To see his emotion in tears on the field, because that's what he's always wanted at Citi Field with the fans, moving on to a high-stakes series, was one of the best things I've seen as a Mets fan in the last 10 years, because Nimmo is obviously one of the easiest players to root for, but it just goes to show you, honestly, what they've built here and how much it means to them to get to kind of cherish that success with the crowd.
Citi Field opened in 2009, and this is the first time the Mets have ever celebrated a clinch of anything on Citi Field grounds.
Great point.
And Brandon Nimmo was drafted by the Mets in 2011. So he's drafted 2 years after Citi Field opened. He made his debut, as you mentioned, 2016. It was the one game or the play-in or whatever it was. And they obviously didn't go anywhere. And he said to Gelbs, in the locker room tonight after the game, he's like, I thought that was just what it was going to be. Just every year we're going to celebrate, and one of these years we might win it all, but we're just going to celebrate every year. He quickly realized that is not how this works. And it doesn't matter. Look, the Texas Rangers won the World Series last year. They've been sitting home and watching this whole thing for quite a while now. You never know when you're going to be back or if you're going to be back. So I think Brandon Nimmo is a guy that he took a second. He looked around. He saw 40 some odd thousand people going crazy. And this is what he had wished for all along. And the opportunity is finally here. And he didn't want to let it pass him by, is something else that he also said in that interview. And, just good for, you love seeing the homegrown guys. Like, as much as Lindor has adapted to New York and become a New York Met and face of the franchise type of player, it's just a little different when you drafted them and you developed them and you dealt with the ups and downs of them coming along as a young player. And, he was a young player during some years that didn't go quite so well for this team. And very happy for him that he was able to have that moment, and the emotions are warranted. And yeah, just really, really good for Brandon Nimmo.
It's a humbling sport, baseball.
For sure.
And like you said, Joe, when you go all the way from 2016 to now chasing that, you go through a lot. You go through a lot of downs throughout that. So before we take a brief look at the NLCS, because we don't even know who the Mets are going to play yet, but we will preview a couple of things from the Mets side of it. Who is your unsung hero out of this right now, Joe?
I don't know how unsung he really is, but David Peterson, the year that this man has had, we forget that he was out for the first couple months of the season because he was returning from a pretty major hip surgery, which is not always an easy thing to bounce back from. And he wasn't quite right out of the gate, but down the stretch, David Peterson was fantastic in this rotation. And it just worked out that he didn't have a spot to start within the confines of where the Mets rotation is set up at. So he slides into the bullpen, which is, I think, something a lot of people have said for at least a couple years. Maybe David Peterson is just a reliever. Maybe he's not a starting pitcher. First off, he's a starting pitcher, but he has taken the bull by the horns for a bullpen that they've made it through. We are where we are. The Mets are in the National League Championship Series, so it's not dump on the bullpen time. But Phil Maton has been inconsistent in the playoffs. Jose Butto has been inconsistent in the playoffs. Edwin Diaz, who we could get into him if you want, but Edwin Diaz has been inconsistent in the playoffs. Realistically, it's been David Peterson, Ryne Stanek, and Reed Garrett have been the relievers that you could rely on in this bullpen so far. And that could flip the way the playoffs work. That could flip once the NLCS starts. Maton could figure it out, or Buto or Diaz, and you're okay. But David Peterson he looks so comfortable out there. When he followed Senga in Philadelphia, tremendous. And tonight he comes in, which, by the way, I don't know about you. I didn't know he was warming up. And when it was Harper when he was coming up, right? And they're like, the Mets are going to the lefty. I go, they're putting Danny Young in this spot. Are you kidding me? No offense, Danny Young, but I was.
But it would be jarring.
I was taken aback that it might be Danny Young. Then I was like, oh wait, it's David Peterson, and the Mets wouldn't be here without David Peterson, and he's going to play a huge role going forward. So maybe or maybe not, he's unsung, but he's not the biggest star on the team, but he's made a massive impact down the stretch, and certainly in this series against Philadelphia, he made a huge difference.
I'm with you all the way. Peterson's been amazing. My unsung hero is going to be Jose Quintana, because he's now pitched in, I won't call this
clinchers,
but 2 clinchers, right?
Yeah.
The Brewers, everything was on the line. Let's be real. If you're a Mets fan or you're the Mets, you want to go back to Philly against Zach Wheeler.
Everything was on the line. Even if it technically wasn't, everything was on the line.
Everything was on the line. Jose Quintana in those 2 games combined, 11 innings pitched, 1 run, none earned, 11 strikeouts. It's 3 walks. I mean, it's and you know what's funny? I was listening to as much stuff as I could on game days for both the Brewers clinching game and the Phillies clinching game. And the constant spiel I got from the national perspective was, well, like, the Mets are throwing Quintana, like this is really a winnable game for the Brewers, the Phillies. And I didn't sit there and go, oh, you know nothing about the Mets, but put some respect on Jose Quintana's name at this point, because this guy is nails when everything is on the line at this point. And yeah, it's Sean Manaea is the story of this team from a pitching perspective, and him leaving the mound in the 6th inning in Game 3 is one of my favorite moments of the entire season. Just the amount of the emotion, Severino rebuilding his career, on and on we go. But Quintana's kind of looked at as an afterthought. He's 35 years old. He's not paid like one of these high-end pitchers, and he just takes the ball and keeps you in the game. The one thing I do want to give a honorable mention to here, Joe, and we discussed this before the playoffs, more in a hopeful way. What happens to Ryne Stanek when it's the postseason? This dude is if the Mets go where they think they can go this year with the NLCS and potentially the World Series, Stanek could go down as one of the greatest postseason pitchers of all time. That's not a closer, right? That's not not viewed as this stopper. I mean, we've talked about it, Joe, but he's got 4 appearances with the Mets already. He's given up 1 earned run. He was lights out for the Astros for years. This dude is just, when I see Stanek warming up, I'm like, man, I feel good right now. Let's rock and roll.
I wanted the Mets to sign Stanek last offseason. I talked about it on this show numerous times that I wanted Ryne Stanek. It was him and Jorge Soler. Those were my 2 guys that I really wanted the Mets to sign. But Stanek, yeah, like you said, Connor, this is a guy that is a proven big game pitcher, proven late in games in the playoffs, and just his celebration after closing out Game 3. And yeah, I mean, Ryne Stanek, tremendous, up to 99. The splitter has looked really good. Mixes in his breaking ball in a time much in the same vein as Peterson, in a time that the bullpen needed somebody to rely on. Ryne Stanek stepped up. And remember this, when Edwin Diaz walked the first 2 batters, here in Game 4 to lead off the 9th inning, Ryne Stanek was up in the bullpen.
Yep.
That is who the Mets were ready to go to. If Diaz were to not turn it on, which he went from a complete inability to throw a strike to, oh, okay, he's back. He's just throwing strikes kind of like normal. And, we could talk about the slider and how he's not really, it doesn't seem like he's trusting that pitch right now. It's kind of a lot of fastballs. But it just shows the trust that Ryne Stanek has earned with Carlos Mendoza and with this staff. And that's what you need when it comes playoff time. You need to find it's almost like a core four. Like you have a full bullpen on your roster, but you don't want to pitch reliever 6 or 7 unless you're up big or down big and you just need to kind of burn some innings. You really want that core four, and Ryne Stanek is firmly in that group for however much longer this stretch goes.
You're listening to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. All right, Joe, before we sign off, we don't know if it's going to be the Padres or the Dodgers. We know they're just beating the absolute snot out of each other as we speak, which is totally fine if you're rooting for the Mets.
Mentally and physically.
Yes. Internally, anything you're expecting for the Mets? Roster changes? How do you line up the pitching? Nothing super crazy, but just anything that you think you can get ahead on with this series.
Yeah, I think from a roster change standpoint, Jeff McNeil is going to play in the Arizona Fall League where, quick down on the farm, Jet Williams and Drew Gilbert and Jacob Reimer and a couple other, Mets pitching prospects are over in the Arizona Fall League playing with a bunch of other top prospects like Termar Johnson from the Pirates and, Bryce Eldridge from the Giants. But Jeff McNeil is going to play with a bunch of prospects for a couple days in the Arizona Fall League, which very funny. I saw a graphic. It says Jeff McNeil returns, 2015 Arizona Fall League alum. So nine years later.
Welcome back, Jeff.
Welcome back to the Prospect League. But Jeff McNeil is going to play in the AFL for a couple of days, get some at bats, and it sounds as if he's going to be on the NLCS roster. And I think that it's Luis Angel Acuna's spot that he's going to take, I would imagine. At this point, I thought Acuna's usage in the playoffs were going to be late inning defense and or base running, pinch running, stealing a base. They're not using him as a pinch runner. He is purely a go in the 8th inning, go in the 9th inning, shift Iglesias to 3rd and have the best defense. Jeff McNeil can play defense, and he could actually provide something offensively where you can put him in the lineup. So it'll be interesting to see how Carlos Mendoza handles it. Is Jeff McNeil coming off the bench as just a lefty stick off the bench? Is he playing some left field with Nimmo in center? Either way,
gives you a little flexibility.
Yeah, it gives you flexibility, and you're bringing back a hitter that, let us not forget, as tough as his start was, Jeff McNeil was on absolute fire for weeks prior to him going down with the injury. So a big potential addition back to the roster with him. And as far as the pitching goes, SNY's Andy Martino wrote a piece that you could read on SNY.TV saying kind of what he thinks the rotation is going to look like for the championship series. And the Mets, of course, have a couple of days off with the series not starting till Sunday. So really they could kind of line up the pitching however their heart desires. But Andy mapped it out as game 1, Kodai Senga, piggybacked by David Peterson, Luis Severino, game 2, Sean Manaea, game 3, and Jose Quintana in game 4. You could switch that around a little bit, but it's a tough balance of putting people on regular rest and making sure some don't have way too much rest. Aaron Nola, to talk about the Phillies really quickly, Aaron Nola is a guy that struggles when he is beyond 7 days of rest. He pitched against the Mets in game 3 on 9 days of rest. Didn't exactly have his best stuff and struggled. So you want to find that balance, whether that's the order or you flip, Severino and Manaea or whatever Carlos Mendoza wants to do. At this point in time, whatever you want to do, Carlos, he is pushing. It doesn't matter what button this man pushes. It just seems like they're all working. So I I certainly trust in him. But looking ahead, that's how I think the pitching will likely shake out. And like you said, we'll see who the Mets face. Right now, the Dodgers have a pretty good lead on San Diego as we record this podcast, which means they'll go to a Game 5, and both those teams' pitchings staffs are going to be in a bit of shambles heading into the NLCS, whereas the Mets can get some much needed rest, playing a million games in 10 days, traveling every other day, flying somewhere. They get a little bit of a breather and be able to schedule their rotation. I think it puts them in a really good spot heading into the NLCS.
And the good news is this isn't the last time you're hearing from us before the series. We're just waiting to know who they're going to play, and then we'll do the full preview where we'll look at the pitching matchups. We'll look at the roster. We'll have everything laid out, whether it is the Padres, whether it is the Dodgers. It is going to be an absolute slugfest, and we can't wait. This is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. Remember to subscribe to the show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. So as soon as that preview is live, if you subscribe, you'll have it right to your phone or however you watch them. Leave us a review with a question, and we'll look for it for a future mailbag. Of course, you can watch every episode as well on SNY's YouTube channel. Become a subscriber over there as well. The Mets are going to the NLCS, and we'll talk to you soon.